I'd like to start just by asking our guests, and we'll start with Alexandra, to introduce herself a little bit and her background, and then Giles, if you could do the same. So Alexandra.
Hopefully my background noise isn't too much, but hi, I'm Alexandra Rickham. I've just recently taken on the role of head of sustainability for World Sailing, the International Federation for Sailing, but I don't start until next month officially. I'm a former Paralympic athlete, and then I moved into the sustainability space in 2017 following my retirement. And I've worked as a consultant to various leagues and various events over the last few years, and namely SailGP, which is a global sailing league, a little bit like F1, I guess, which is high-speed boats. And I've been building out their program for the last 3 years. So yeah, I guess that's a little snapshot.
Thanks, Alexandra. Giles?
Good morning, everyone. Alexandra, you didn't tell us what sport you competed in.
Sorry, sailing as well.
Oh, you were on the sailing. Oh, fantastic. So good morning, everyone. Giles Stanford. I am the Director of Global Events for CSM Live, which means that we get involved in Commonwealth Games, Olympic Games, Football World Cups, but we do lots of other sailing events, motorsport events, for Formula E in particular. So quite a wide portfolio of events we get involved in. And for the last couple of years, I've been sort of driving forward the sustainability agenda within CSM, looking at it as a contractor. And what we do is we produce things, and we have lots of materials and resources and logistics, and combining all that to try and come up with sustainable solutions, and then work with our clients, rights holders, to sort of create a long-term strategies as to the partnership between contractor and client, to try and make it for all of us to achieve the sustainable objectives that we want. So it's nice to be here. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thanks both. Great that we've got sort of somebody from the rights holder governing body side, but also somebody that represents a sort of major industry supplier who, is quite often is very much at the sharp end of delivering on the sustainable strategies that are put in place. Alexandra, I'd like to start with you, and we talked a little bit about this before we came on live. Was sustainability for many people immediately conjures up environmental issues, and that's obviously a hugely important part of it. But perhaps I could just ask you, sustainability from a SailGP and World Sailing, that encompasses many other aspects of the industry. So maybe you could just elaborate a little bit on sustainability and what that means, what that encompasses to you.
Sure. So sustainability, like in the holistic sense, is based on 3 pillars: environmental, social, and economic. And so whenever we've been considering sustainability, the way that I've always considered it is around those 3 pillars. So very much around 1, the environmental impact that an event is creating, and 2, around, can we actually have sport that's going to be able to last forever? Because the realities that we know are that sport has, that we always have to make sure that we're expanding our fan base to be able to have economic sustainability and to keep, smaller clubs, both from the grassroots level all the way up to elite. And 3 is around the social impact, so 1, diversity and inclusion is part of my remit. So for instance, at World Sailing, very much looking at how do we become a more diverse sport, and all of these things are intrinsically linked together. If you're environmentally, if you're not watching your environmental impact, then there are costs longer term for the sport as a whole. So, sailing is a perfect example. If we keep destroying our oceans, then clearly as an event, we're not going to have it. The more extreme weather that we have because of climate change, it means that we're not going to be able to have events. So that's economically not viable. And, from a social perspective, if you're going to get a bigger fan base, you need to have a more diverse sport, which is going to appeal to more people, which is why football has been so successful, because everybody in the world, can be involved in football. And so, other sports, smaller sports like sailing are definitely trying to expand their remit to be able to appeal to more people and also deliver better social impact on the ground when we have these events. and make sure that we're getting more people involved and actually trying to involve the local communities. So there is a legacy aspect.
Great, thank you. Giles, coming to you, and I know CSM Live are heavily involved with the Birmingham Commonwealth Games, both as a supplier, but also as a sponsor and a partner to that. As a business that is interwoven with the sort of the delivery side of major events, how are you seeing rights holders and governing bodies really engaging with the sustainability agenda? How has that changed and over the last few years in terms of priorities and practical sort of strategies being put in place to try and mitigate the sort of environmental impact?
Obviously it's definitely climbing up the agenda. It's certainly not on top of the agenda yet. I mean, but you wind the clock back a wee bit to the London Olympic Games, and I think I might be slightly wrong, but I think I'm quite accurate to think that there is a very heavy sustainability angle on every supplier within the London Games. And to be honest, it was a bit of a pain in the ass, but we had to deal with it. They forced us and they reviewed everything. What's the sustainable solution? What are you doing with that? What's your post-event plan for the materials you're using? And, it was something that was coming at us and we had to consider it. And I think in a couple of years after that, it subsided a bit, but the undercurrent was growing. And in the last 5 years, it is now kind of right up forefront. It's not if you were a procurement department, they're not considering, it isn't the first conversation you have with procurement. Now, my view is it should be further up there and you have to balance up the price of what you're buying with your carbon price and with your climate price, let's call it. But it's certainly, we are now getting questions every proposal that we do. All our clients are saying, what's the sustainable solution? How can you do that? Is it going to cost me more? Or show me options where I can be sustainable for the same price. What are you going to be doing with this afterwards? And so we're what we're trying to do is speak to the rights holders. Birmingham, the sustainability program for Commonwealth Games is extremely good, and they have a very clear targets for carbon offset and materials and materials and usage and post-event, and we're constantly trying to design in that post-event reuse. And what we also want to do is kind of trying to standardize what we're using, so it's not something that is used once for Birmingham Commonwealth Games. Why not use the same that FIFA are using or UEFA are using, the same sizes? So I mean, you're not making life just boring and generic, but you're kind of reusing things that already exist. And in our little speciality of look and branding, that is a bit unique. I mean, the event industry as a whole is based on a rental model. Tents, fences, generators, they're all kind of rented. So there's lots of reuse there already. But in our bit of the branding and signage, we're trying to, and I think to a very degree of success, to standardize this, to specify materials that can be reused, almost down to the eyelets. What is an eyelet made of, and how can that be recycled? Can we put it in a machine that will recycle it with the polyester? Or we're trying to work with the communities. I mean, much more of a sort of social purpose and social value is post-event of what can we do with this material in the local community after the event. So it's a sort of a multi-pronged approach, but it is, the rights holders have got it right up here. There's still that procurement discussion to have, but it is certain that no one can ignore it. Even the IOC and UEFA produced a good document last year, particularly in event overlay, of some guidance of how to take it forward. And we were involved in helping them put that together, and it provides very good guidelines for a lot of rights holders to take and say, okay, this is what I need. But you are at risk of, it's like an onion, you can't peeling it back, and how far do you go back, how far you go back. We have to accept there's always going to be events, and we got to try and do better than we have been. And I think every year we are all getting better at producing those events.
I think it's I think we all agree that we want a world with major sports events. I mean, we all that's we're in the industry, we love it, and I'm sure plenty of people are watching the Beijing Winter Olympics and enjoying it. But at the same time, the awareness of the environmental impact now is so much higher than it's ever been, and it continues to go up the agenda. And spectators and fans and sponsor brands are starting to ask much more pertinent, difficult questions of rights holders, governing bodies, and event owners around the sustainability angle. Now, Alexandra, you obviously were heavily involved with Sail GP, which is a rights holder that really is sort of where sustainability is baked into that whole proposition. And there's we all know, obviously, Formula E, Extreme E. There's many more events and sports now developing where sustainability is a core part of the proposition. What sort of strategies did you put in place around some of the events that you hosted and the sport as a whole? And how closely did you work with your supply chain to ensure the delivery of those sustainability objectives?
Well, we were trying to work really closely, and I think the thing is that we all know that the Scope 3 emissions, which are those supply chain emissions, essentially, in our fan travel and accommodation and transport, are the things that are very hard to control. But I think working with suppliers who were going to be able to help us on that journey was really key focus. And and it's a difficult one, as Giles says. It's not as simple as just saying, okay, we're just going to work with that person. It's some of the suppliers that we chose, they specifically were like, we are going to offset our footprint. We're going to calculate our footprint. We're going to offset our footprint. And that was the supplier that we were forward facing. We were like, right, we want to work with you because you are aligned with our purpose strategy, the way in which we want to go about. Because, from day one, SailGP was measuring its footprint. Of course, there's an offset portion to that, and quite a major piece, but at the same time there's a huge focus around reduction. And sailing, World Sailing and SailGP are both signatories to the UN Sport for Climate Action, and that is starting to come into effect in terms of registering how much you are actually, what your footprint is, and how are you going to actually deal with that. What are your reduction targets? How are you going to offset that, and etc. So the thing is, I think, and then on top of that, we had to focus on kind of like our big areas, big ticket items. So things like travel and transport, during the COVID period, when we were all in lockdowns, actually what SailGP did was went through all of the containers and looked at how could you pack more efficiently. So like 10 containers were removed from the fleet of containers that were being shipped around the world, just on efficiency of packing, and that has significant reduction in terms of carbon. And it's taking those small bits, which aren't actually that small, and really focusing in on them and deciding that, how can we reduce, for World Sailing and for SailGP, likewise, a focus coming up now is decarbonization of support fleets. Because when you host a sailing event, you have loads of supporting boats, coach boats, camera boats, all sorts of different things. And actually, how do we get them off the water, or how do we have them using more sustainable fuels, or or electrification, And so at the moment, the technology is not quite there. So we're playing a bit of a catch-up game, because it's not like EVs. It's we now need to take that sort of EV model and apply it to the water, for watercraft. And so that's a huge area of focus for the sailing industry as a whole, and the maritime industry, to be perfectly honest. So there are projects like, loads of the sailing leagues have projects around decarbonization, and Paris 2024, it's a big focus for them. And then the other thing is temporary power, which is a huge area that we need development in terms of actually loads of these events have generators on site, and a lot of them will tell you it's because of broadcast, we need to have a continuous supply, but a lot of those generators are still being fueled by diesel. And it's like, actually, what technology can we employ to be able to reduce that carbon footprint. You know, are we going to go down the hydrogen route? Is it green hydrogen? You know, so there are loads of pieces to that. And then on the front end of all of that is around the contracts and making sure that we are having these discussions with our suppliers at the beginning of the journey. Because like Giles said, you know, because otherwise it gets super complicated when you're trying to, you know, recoup at the end, you know, exactly what that cost has been, you know, environmentally or socially. So it's very complicated, and I think especially for like moving leagues, it's particularly complicated because every country you go to has different standards, there are different ways of doing things. You might not be able to access appropriate recycling if you have, you know, a recycling strategy that says you need to hit this, you know, number at every event, but you get to somewhere and they don't have the facilities to be able to. How do you deal with that? And, you know, and what does that conversation look like with those suppliers that you have on the ground? So, you know, and also, can you influence change in those host cities to be able for them to actually bring those facilities on board? And can you work with and collaborate with other leagues who might be using the same places as you? So, you know, but the exciting thing is that everybody seems to be moving in the right direction on that trajectory. It's just that we really need to speed things up and get, you know, and really start to harness all of these events kind of working more together than we've been seeing.
Yeah, Alex, just to follow you, I think you it was quite interesting how you see local industries picking up a challenge. I mean, in Qatar, where obviously they've got a huge event coming their way, the recycling business over there is, you know, there's lots of, you know, I think they probably get quite good state funding to help do that, but that's part of the sort of a rather sort of new legacy of these big events is a local recycling industry for everything that probably didn't exist beforehand, or it was just, you know, waste to energy. And there's lots of people moving there saying, okay, we can recycle this, we can recycle that post event, and you know that will be a new industry ready to go in Qatar. But I think coming to what we kind of honing on is the reduction and the circularity and the reuse, and that takes a commitment from a supplier and from the owner, the rights owner, for a sort of long-term objective. Because if you and I know it's difficult from some events that you're bouncing around from country to country, but if you have a sort of long-term, a mutual objective, and you can build that over a 2, 3, 4 year thing, it is so much more productive than just new contract each year, and trying to, and I think a lot of the rights holders are getting that, because that's the only way they're going to achieve what they have told their audience or even their boards. This is how we're going to do it. And you know, I think, to be honest, their value goes up in an event that shows that it is sustainable, and actually a supplier that shows that it's sustainable is economically sensible. Your value goes up, your reputation goes up, you know, so you'll get more audience. You know, if you're in the business to sell on your business, and the multiples are increased on a sustainable charts, if you look to be sustainable, you are more valuable, and that's got to be an incentive for everybody to move in that direction. But there are many different ways of getting there.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big portion of this is also how we engage our fans. Like, we all know sport has this huge platform, this ability to create change. Like you've said, you know, actually, like in Qatar, this is potentially creating change in terms of actually the way in which the country operates as a whole. So the reality is that, can we then take this message, you know, and I think, you know, for sailing and for the likes of SailGP, that's a big part of it. And a lot of the propositions that we see coming forward at the moment are around, how do we get our fans involved in this? How do we get them making those small behavioral changes if they see the league doing it, and also if they see the athletes doing it? Because
exactly.
For me, a big portion of it is around athletes, and actually how can they use their platform to drive change effectively and to engage that audience, you know. And I know we were talking before, but SailGP, one of the things that they've done is they've created this impact league, which means that the teams are now actually competing over impact, you know, and sustainability. as well as on the water at the same time. So actually they have two leagues running at once, and there are NGOs involved. So there's the potential to win money for NGOs. And, so actually the gamification of sustainability, is something that they're trying out, and it's, it seems to be working, because the teams are kind of, get quite, shirty with each other about the fact that, I'm doing this better than you are, and they're always trying to come up with new ways to change things, removing cable ties, which I know sounds like a small thing, but actually we all know that, if you have to keep reapplying cable ties, especially in your business, Charles, it adds up really quickly, as a small example. And so, it's just things like that. Actually, how do you find reusable alternatives? And it's really exciting to see them get quite excited about it, so yeah, I think it's,
I think it's very, we try as an entity to be sort of forward looking with these conversations, because it's very easy to sit here and it's sort of doom and gloom about major events and the sort of carbon production and all the rest of it. But what is fascinating from this conversation is the role that sport and major events has to play in driving the agenda, but also a sort of catalyst for solutions. Actually saying, right, well, as we talked about, yes, we want to have major events in this world. That we all agreed on that. We can't go on how it's been going on, and there is a the momentum behind change now is such that it is an unstoppable imperative for the world of sport and major events to actually address these challenges. And that's not just offsetting your carbon and planting trees, which is great and is a step in the right direction, but how do we actually address these? What is an alternative to cable ties? As you said, small thing, but however many billions of cable ties are produced, per year through major sports events that end up, in landfill. But you say that I think is fascinating, and I'd love, Giles, from your side, what are you seeing from in terms of really driving solutions and looking at ways of doing things differently that are more sustainable, that reduce impact, that can then bleed out into other industries and other areas?
I think probably. I think from a material in our bit look and branding, I think materials I reckon I can recycle probably 80 properly recycle, not just waste to energy, 85% of what we use. I mean, in the last year we've cracked with a great company down in Plymouth, recycling polyester, taking polyester and a mechanical process to turn it back into a yarn so it can be reused, which has been driven from the clothing industry, but we've sort of tacked on the back of it. And it's been a slow moving challenge, but now we can take all our polyester flags, fence scrims, whatever we have, as long as they're 100% polyester, we can recycle them. Obviously, paper, cardboard, that's been recyclable for a long time. PET products, we can do that. We're kind of trying to move away from PVC. Technically, there's still some things which have to be kind of PVC, but there are plenty of alternatives. I think from a materials point of view, we're nearly there. There's a few challenges around self-adhesives and a little... The backing paper on self-adhesive is called glassine, and that's a bit of a nightmare to recycle, but it's a problem. It's a big problem, and there are people thinking about it, and we're moving in the right direction. I think so materials are all right. Where we also need to think about is the operations, is before upstream and downstream of that, is the design process. So are we making sure whilst we're designing it, we're designing in reuse, we are speaking to our client and say, if I make it like this, I can use it for this afterwards. And hopefully they go, yeah, that's a really good idea. Or can we have a design that doesn't, a sponsor, say to a sponsor, are you stuck with that logo for 3 years? I really don't want you to change your logo next year and the year after in your 3-year contract, because that means I've got to reprint everything, and that is not what we want to do. So there's quite an important thing on the design stage. Materials, I say, we're pretty confident with all our materials. And then you've got the logistics, the operations around it. So it's just, really being down to the cable tie. it's being smart with that. How you reduce your journeys. I need one lorry to go to a venue rather than 3. But fundamentally, the driver for that, good logistics, and good logistics equals low carbon, low output, because you're thinking about it, you're considering it, you're combining journeys. Is also financially sensible. It's the most economic way of doing it. So you put the two together and you come up with the right solution. If you're having to send lots of lorries to the same venue, your planning hasn't been very good, and therefore your footprint's bigger and your cost is bigger. So, that's is also there's a strong economic driver to be better. But you kind of cable tie. I mean, I think we used about 700,000 cable ties at the Olympic Games. And we had a sweepstake on it. But anyway, that's why I kind of remember how many we used. But we've now moved on to bungee cords a lot. Really good. There are reusable cable ties, but they're kind of at the pricey end of the market yet. The other way is to educate the guys, pick them all up. They are plastic. If you pick them all up and you keep them separate and don't contaminate that, they can be recycled. So you cut the tails off and the actual, so they can go back into the system if you have a discipline to pick them all up. But
no, let's just get rid of them. Sorry, like they just blow like marine events. They're right by the water. They blow into the water. It's like literally like it's not the way forward.
I know. But you go to some countries and they don't use them. They use little wire tags, and they'll just be very quick where we've gone, and they use a little wire thing. So there's different ways of looking at it depending where you are. And the cable tie is the sort of the really naughty boy because we use so many of them. Yeah. But the bungee cords we lose a lot. I mean, funny enough, we use a lot of bungee cords. And they work fantastically, and we've got them for a long time. So you have to consider the whole chain from design right the way through to the operations of it, and actually then you reverse logistics of getting it back into your warehouse, separating it, keeping it dry, which is a big, especially with polyesters. And then baling it and getting it to your recycling thing. So there's from a contractor point of view, it's a long journey that we travel on to with these materials and operations that we do, and that's why if we're kind of sitting, side by side with our client, so they understand what the challenges are, and you're kind of transparent about what we're doing and where it's going. There it is, that's the mutual benefit.
And Alexandra, just on that point, I mean, how the question there that pops to my mind is, who really is responsible for measuring all of this impact and the recycling aspect, and where does the balance of responsibility lie between rights holder, governing body, supplier, and other other stakeholders to ensure that these standards are adhered to?
I think it it starts with the event clearly. They have to set out very clearly what their standards are, what their strategy is, and also put those demands into the contracts and be very clear and transparent with what their expectations are. And I think then you have to choose the right suppliers who are going to be able to actually supply these things and drive the change forward. But I think at the end of the day, it's a two-way street. As an example, the number of stakeholders that you have involved in any one event is huge, and it needs to be, you also need to be working with host cities who are on that trajectory. It's great to expand the remit of different places to go, but at the same time, if you're going to places who are bidding for events who have no desire and are not on the same purpose journey as you, then why would you be going there, in all honesty? You have to think about these things. If they want your event there to be able to help drive that change, then I think that's a really exciting prospect, that you're actually able to have influence. So I think it goes both ways, but as we've said, it's super complicated. It's not as simple as just saying it's that person's responsibility. I do think, however, once it is put into a contract and it's made very clear, it is the responsibility of you to be able to track it as the rights holder as such, but it's also the responsibility of your supplier who's agreed to the fact that they're going to supply you with the appropriate information in a time frame, so that you can actually make sure that you're continuously improving, because that's a huge section of the journey, is about continuous improvement. How are you going to make your next event, either in that same venue or your next event that you're going to, better than your last one? How are you going to drive change? And if you're not able to get those suppliers on board, then you need to find the appropriate supplier who's going to be able to facilitate those needs. And that's a very difficult space to work within. So it's the responsibility of both parties, but in different ways.
Yeah. And what we're trying to do is, from a supply point of view, is give that information. Obviously, we log all the materials because that's how we invoice. We know what we're producing because the invoicing the client. And if we know what those materials are, and we are actually just finalizing a process to be able to calculate the carbon of all those materials. So at the end of an event, we can say you had X square meters of this, and this, and this is what the transport was, and people had to fly. So it gives you a calculation of the tonnage or kilos that the event cost in carbon. And then I think there is a frank discussion with the supplier, with the client, which is probably already framed in the contract, of what you do with it. And I think it's a mutual responsibility to come up with, to have an offset solution for what you've done. But I think what we want to be able to move to is, in the future, to be able to give the client a choice of a low carbon product rather than a high carbon product. Let's assume that they can all be recycled, but we're kind of moving beyond recycling. We're looking at what is the best carbon purchase, and that becomes part of the equation. Or do I need less of it to start off with, and then what is the least expensive from a carbon point of view of the materials I want to use in my event, and then at the end of the event we decide, okay, we've got to offset 100 tons, right? Where are we going to go and do that? And sometimes it might be particularly around the Commonwealth Games, what we're doing it isn't all about planting a tree. It might be in some of the African members of the Commonwealth Games, it might be converting some of the household cookers who are burning charcoal into burning something else. So there's lots of different projects that you can get involved with for the offset. We at CSM, we're doing a tree planting scheme against our annual revenue, but I think there's other things that can be more of a social purpose of what you want to achieve, which help you do that offset. But that, I think, is very much part of a conversation that the supplier should have with his client, the federations, to make sure it's all agreed up front. Everybody knows what they're responsible for, how you're tracking it, the agreed kilos, the agreed grams per square meter, or however you want to measure it. And hopefully then everybody's got the right information to make the right decision to move forward in the best possible way.
I think a big part of that also, just to consider, is that we need the market forces to start driving so that the cost of this actually isn't prohibitive, because a lot of events are not making necessarily the right choice, like the better choice in terms of carbon, and in turn because of the fact that sometimes the cost is that much higher. But we all know that as Giles has said, is that also do you need to brand every single inch of a city or an area? No, actually, how about just being very focused in that design process of where are you actually going to catch people? What does need to happen? Can it be reused in terms of, logo changes, etc. So I think, but we do need the price point. The problem is that, a branding on something which is not sustainable, which has a lower carbon footprint, is still generally significantly cheaper. And so lots of events are making, effectively the wrong choice. And we need to be able to get more events making the right choice to be able to have that step change in terms of having those lower carbon options being the number one choice put forward, and I think also looking at what other options there are, so one of the things I know that we were testing at SailGP last year was, signage, which was electronic solar signage, which then could be used for wayfinding. It could be used for, sponsors to be able to, so it had multi-purpose use. So actually moving it around, and the cost of that carbon in terms of transport was actually lower if we could use it instead of having all of, having to carry around branding, to carry around wayfinding signage, to carry around all of these other things. Actually, if we could just do it on one single post, then suddenly it becomes, more worthwhile from a carbon perspective and longer term from a cost perspective, because it's something that can be used, past logo changes, etc. So.
Yeah, I mean, we've got about 5 minutes to go, and I just encourage anyone that's got questions to drop those in the box. But Alexander, you bring up something there around the technology side, which I think, the stark reality is that to bring about the scale of change that we need, technology is going to play an absolutely fundamental role in that. And you touched on earlier about broadcasting and the power that is used in terms of the OB compound, outside broadcast compound, and just the scale of that. And you start to think about a move towards more of that being done remotely, powered, via the cloud. I often think, by way of example, when England went to South Africa to play cricket last year, and none of the media could go because of the COVID restrictions. So poor old Jonathan Agnew had to commentate from a pretty cold, miserable broom cupboard in his home in wherever that was in London. And frankly, it didn't make the blindest bit of difference to people listening on Test Match Special. And he didn't have to, and all of the ancillary transport and what have you that goes with that didn't happen. And you sort of think, well, I mean, any journalist listening will be sort of spluttering on their coffee. But is there a need to have hundreds of people in Beijing reporting on this, where so much of it can be done remotely? The technology around broadcast now that can be done.
There's a lot of
the presenting team are not in Beijing, and it doesn't make the blindest bit of difference. And I think that there will need to be some fundamental changes in how these events are delivered, both from a broadcast point of view. Alexandra, you talked about fans and how they engage, an imperative to, we all want to go to live events, but can we enjoy it differently that doesn't require you to fly around the world? I mean, very interesting report came out recently, obviously, about FIFA and expanding the number of teams from 32 to 48, and the environmental impact of that in terms of, another 16 teams flying and being accommodated and being fed and venues, and massive. I think it's a really interesting aspect that there will need to be some huge technological implementations to really shift the dial on a lot of these problems.
It's not really huge at the moment. I mean, SailGP is actually a perfect example of it. They've, they have, I think, 70 people, or like the vast majority of their broadcast is actually based here in the UK. They don't move. The high speed internet now, like, the cabling, you can ping it back in milliseconds. There's no delay, basically. The commentators don't actually go to the events, like that's been completely removed. And that's not because of COVID. That's literally because that was the decision. Actually, they were going to use technology from day one to help drive that change, so they weren't having to cart people all around the world. We've seen F1 is also doing the same thing. And so suddenly you have a hugely reduced, the broadcast compound suddenly very, very tiny, but we do still need to think about the energy that's being used on the ground. We need to also think about the energy that's being used in the cloud. Are you working with providers who are either offsetting or using green energy supply for that? So, there are follow-on, going to be issues in the longer term. But I think a lot of the technology is already there. We can make that change. People, yes, you want to be able to engage, and there is a difference between being face to face, but COVID has shown us that we're able to do so many things remotely now, and actually we just need to have hybrid approaches, I think, to most of these things, which actually will achieve the same result, because sometimes you do need people to be there. It's not as simple as pointing.
It's not one or the other, is it? But I think it's
No.
it's mitigating that. Just look, we've about a minute to go. Just a question in from Lizzie Dodd about, we've touched on the branding, and it raises the topic around the involvement in sponsors in this whole conversation. But sustainable solutions potentially impacting on value of sponsorship and return on investment and that sort of thing, and balancing that. I suppose moral obligation of big global brands to be doing the right thing versus a sort of marketing objectives that are laid out as part of a sponsorship package. I mean, Giles, do you see brands, are they putting pressure on you to deliver better, more sustainable? They're very much part of the conversation.
Yeah, completely. And I think reputationally, it's not good for them to start just, if it doesn't move, put a logo on it. It doesn't do them any good. So I don't think the price. The implementation of your sponsorship is becoming more digital. The physical branding of it is still there, but there is definitely a discussion that, do I really need to do that? What's the impact going to be? You're not rolling into a city, as Lizzie said that, and just plastering it with branding on the behalf of the sponsors, because they don't particularly want that any longer. They're kind of after a much more focused, interesting sort of activation and engagement, rather than just put my logo everywhere. And I think that doesn't devalue what they're doing. It's not changing the price. I think it's actually probably increasing it, because they want to be attached to an event that has a good reputation for being sustainable, and that's a sort of joint objective of the sponsor and the event.
Yeah, and I think when you look at events like SailGP and Extreme E and Formula E, which are sort of predicated on sustainability, the brands that are involved in those are doing it, because of
even right at the high end of it. The Olympic Games, you look at Dow, they do a huge amount of work. Sort of, you don't really see their brand everywhere, but they're doing an awful lot of work in the background on the sustainable materials and the chemical analysis of sustainability they're doing, but they've got a different objective to having their name everywhere. It's much more sort of an engaged approach to leverage their value from a sponsorship. So I think it's very different.
Great. Well, look, we try and keep our webinars pretty short and sharp and allow people to get back to their morning coffee. So it's been a brilliant 45 minutes. Thank you very much to both of you for joining. Some fascinating.
Dan, I'll just answer Ahmad's question. I would just say, to the last point, I think technology. How can you introduce technology into sustainability in major events to make it more sustainable? It would be an interesting little angle on your PhD. Because there's certainly some technologies that COVID has accelerated in terms of digital twins of venues and being able to view things remotely and do site visits and operational planning without actually going to the venue. I think that would be a nice and an interesting question.
I think logistics and fan engagement is actually, for me, like a really key area, because we know that's a huge impact area. So actually, how are we going to engage the fans more effectively in their in their own homes or in their own clubs local to them, to major events, so they don't necessarily have to travel, and that it's still exciting and it still brings that something special that we all feel from live sports.
Brilliant. Well, listen, thank you very much. We will be at InSport. We are planning a course for later in March, much more in-depth conversation around sustainability in sport. So please keep an eye out for further information on that. But Giles, Alexandra, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you both very much indeed for joining on a sunny Friday. Enjoy your weekends. When I end this, we're going to be unceremoniously turfed off, so I'll say my goodbyes. Thank you to you both. Thanks everyone for listening in, and everybody enjoy their weekend. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Bye bye. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks everyone. Ciao.